Right, thanks very much, Kate, and hello, everybody. Today, I'm going to tell you a bit about my life since I was diagnosed with melanoma, but I'm going to try and talk more about my reflections, thoughts, and feelings along the way. And I hope that some of it resonates with some of you, and perhaps even helps some of you with your own strategies. Before I start, there's a couple of things I want to say. The first is that, as we know, increasing numbers of people are being diagnosed with melanoma in their 30s and 40s, and I can see there's quite a few here today. So to you specifically, but more generally, I'd like to say that I often reflect that had that happened to me at a time in my life when my children were still at school and I still had further career ambitions and years of a mortgage still to pay, it would have been an awful lot tougher to cope with than it was for me at the time that I was diagnosed, but it was still very tough. The second thing I want to say is I feel rather humble being asked to speak here today because I'm pretty certain that many, maybe even most of you in the room, will actually have a melanoma story that's much worse than mine. But nonetheless, when I started to think about the things that I wanted to draw out of my experience and talk about today, I realized that time was going to be very tight. So I'll just crack on. I was diagnosed with melanoma in 2015, and I got the news in a phone call when I was with some really good friends, and one of them was a GP, and he went, "Oh shit, Willie, that is bad, that is really bad." and I sort of went, "Really?" Because I really didn't know very much about melanoma at all. But now, 9 years on, 7 surgical procedures, 2 emergency admissions into hospital, around about 40 scans, hundreds of needles, and life-changing side effects of a year of very expensive immunotherapy, I realized why he said that. And of course, everybody in the room realizes why he said that. Sometime before that, I'd noticed a mole on the side of my body, around about here, was looking a bit different to the other moles in my body, but it was very difficult to see, and it remained out of sight and out of mind for quite a long time, until one day my attention was drawn to it again. I thought, "Oh, that doesn't look too good. Maybe I should go to the GP." But another bit of me was saying, well, it's just something on my skin. It's not hurting. I feel perfectly fit and healthy, and I'm actually far too busy at work to take any time off to go to see the GP. Luckily, eventually common sense prevailed, and I went to the GP, and we got this very blurred photograph. And we spoke about going away and coming back again in a few months' time to then see whether or not, see what the mole looked like against that photo. And just, in the course of the conversation, the plan changed and I was referred to dermatology, but just for peace of mind. And I often reflect on just how different my story might have been if I'd been in a rush that day. Now, that's a horrible picture, so I'll take it down. I'm going to replace it with a picture of me in my happy place, because I believe everybody needs to have a happy place, and mine is anywhere where there are mountains. I can while away an hour quite easily on a PET scanner, just shutting my eyes and thinking about being somewhere up in the mountains. So I went to dermatology, and 2 hours later I left, having lost the mole, but instead having gained a bit of knowledge of melanoma, and I really didn't like the sound of it at all. But at the same time, I just kept thinking, this little thing, it just cannot be that serious. It really can't be. And apart from anything else, surely bad things just happen to other people, not people like me. And then, of course, I got the phone call I just told you about, which I realized was a point at which my life changed forever. I was booked in for a wider local excision and sentinel lymph node biopsy, went to have the surgery. It was all a completely new experience to me. I'd never had an overnight stay in hospital before, and I was viewing this just as a new experience, a bit of learning. I had the surgery, thought, great, put that down to experience, and I'll get a letter in a few weeks' time telling me that everything's fine. But instead, I was just at work one day, and the phone rang, answered it, recognized the voice of the consultant, and could immediately tell that this was not good news. I think we've probably all been there. So this had gone from something visible on the outside of my body that I wasn't particularly concerned about to something invisible, somewhere inside my body, cancer. And I could hardly bring myself to even think that word, let alone say it. I'm going to come back to this picture for a moment. Part of the reason I chose this particular picture was that a few years before all this, I'd actually been walking up this same mountain, as I have done many times. But on that occasion, I'd been a bit complacent, and I didn't realize until it was too late that bad weather was coming in. I was getting buffeted by the wind and sleet. I was feeling pretty disorientated. I couldn't see more than just a few feet in front of me. And I didn't know exactly where I was, but I did know that there were some very dangerous cliffs nearby, and this could really turn serious. Suddenly, the situation felt completely overwhelming. I felt very alone and vulnerable. Panic started to well up inside me. I was thinking, this is actually happening to me. And what do I need to do, step by step, to maximize the odds of a safe outcome, minimize the odds of a bad outcome. Absolutely nothing else mattered. And I can relate that to the phone call with the consultant, because when the call finished, I had exactly that same sense of being completely overwhelmed, alone, and vulnerable. Panic started to well up inside me, and I was saying, God, this is happening to me. And I started to think, right, okay, what do I need to do to maximize the odds of a good outcome and minimize the odds of a bad outcome? And I've found that analogies like this have actually been very helpful to me in dealing with my melanoma. The consultant had told me that the next step back in those days was an axillary dissection. And for that, I would need many weeks off work. So I had to start telling people. And a lot of people just didn't even say anything. And those that did, I do recognize were trying to be helpful, but they'd say something like, oh, just keep positive and it'll all be fine. Yeah, that's important, but it doesn't make it go away. And worse than that, though, I lost count of the number of people that just said, oh, just skin cancer? Nothing to worry about then. You'll be glad it's nothing serious. Now, it's absolutely, utterly inconceivable that anybody would say that to anybody else who's just received a cancer diagnosis. But yet, I bet that everybody in this room has experienced that to some extent, and I would love to be able to do something to change that. So I went for the surgery, and afterwards I remember being quite shocked, actually, at just the extent of the surgery. I remember being really worried about lymphedema, something I hadn't even thought about, but shown photos like we saw earlier, and I thought, oh my goodness, you know. And after about 10 days in hospital, I got home and I had weeks ahead of me to recuperate and reflect. And I wanted to understand better what this was all about. And I'd been told not to Google it, but of course I did. And within 2 hours of clicking the mouse, I was in the GP surgery having a meltdown. I got into the routine, as we all do, of regular checks at the hospital. And at one of these, I bumped into an old school friend. He'd also been diagnosed with melanoma, and so we compared notes. And as I find out more about it all, I realized that actually that's probably quite a rare sight to see two men talking about the melanoma diagnosis. And I was very concerned to find that men are 30% more likely than women to get melanoma, and even more likely than that to die of it. But yet, I've never seen those proportions reflected in any of the support networks that I engage with. I have to say that today is the closest that I've ever seen by quite a long way, so well done to the organizers. I also spent a lot of time sitting at home reflecting on life, particularly the finite nature of life and what was important to me. And for that, rather bizarrely, I actually thank melanoma, because without it, I might never have actually got off that treadmill of life and pressed a reset button, which I think has led to some aspects of my life actually being better as a result. And one of the things that was really important to me was my love of the mountains. And I decided that once I was back to fitness, I would really give a high priority to a challenge that I'd set myself many, many years ago. And I've been picking away at it over many years, but other commitments always got in the way. And that was to climb all 282 mountains in Scotland over 3,000 feet. They're actually called Munros, so there's a bit of a personal interest in that as well. And when I got to the stage where I was fit enough to go back out again and embark on that challenge, I found that the challenge had a dimension to it that really took me by surprise. I felt very nervous being outside in the sun. And so long days up in the mountains in the sun, the wind, the elements, with no shade, no shelter, was a huge difficulty. And I think it took me about 2 years to get those feelings to be manageable and to feel reasonably confident that with the right clothing and protection, I could still do this sort of thing and minimize the risk of further damage to my skin. Now, I have to say that those days up in the mountains, doing this challenge and the preparation beforehand and the planning and the reflections afterwards were hugely good, hugely beneficial to all aspects of my well-being. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody should go and take up mountaineering, but I would suggest that everybody's got something in their lives that they recognize is good for their well-being, but probably all too often, day-to-day pressures get in the way. And when the going gets tough, it's really important to really prioritize whatever it is that works for that particular individual to look after their own well-being. It could be anything. It could be an activity, a pastime, a person, a place, preferably not sunbathing, though. So, yes, after about 12 weeks or so, I got back to work, and people had noticed a change in me. I had become quite intolerant of anybody who prevaricated and wasted time, because I wanted every day to count and make a difference. I also noticed that in all aspects of my life, I no longer got all stressed and worked up at the stupid little things that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. And I think that's probably quite a good thing. Gradually, months turned into years. My scans were all clear. And a few years on, and I was starting to think, I wasn't thinking about melanoma as much. I still thought about it a lot, but not as much as I had done. And I was really beginning to think that I'd had a lucky escape and that melanoma was now part of my past. And then there were some changes at work, which were very detrimental to me and another 4 colleagues. And we found it very upsetting, very stressful, but we just had to get on with it. And after a few months, this very, very high level of stress, I started to notice, and I couldn't understand why, but I started to notice that amongst other things, I was feeling anxious in the sun again, and I was starting to worry about melanoma, another primary or a secondary. And I was worrying much more than I ever had done. It felt like my recovery had gone backwards. And I couldn't work out why that would be. And I spent a lot of time just trying to sort of think it through and reflect on it. And I came to this conclusion, which a professional might tell me that I've got completely wrong, but it worked and it helped me to sort it out in my own mind. We've all got a certain capacity for stress, and if the stress in our lives is less than that capacity, then we can function perfectly well. Just in the same way as this jug has a certain capacity for water, and if the water in the jug is less than the capacity, it sits there nice and calmly. Now, if we imagine the water in the jug to be the stress in our lives from all sorts of different sources, and the jug to be the capacity for stress, what I probably hadn't realized was that there was there's like a sort of Damocles of melanoma hanging over me. And as a result, my stress levels were probably closer to capacity than I recognized. And when this additional huge amount of work-related stress came pouring in on top, the whole lot just came bubbling over. So I struggled on with this for about a year, and then actually got early retirement. And it was about 3 or 4 years before I had actually planned to retire. And I viewed those 3 or 4 years as an opportunity to really focus on the things that were important to me. And because of the fact I'd had that sort of reflection after being diagnosed with melanoma, I knew exactly how I was going to try to use that time. And it was also an opportunity to close the door on bad things in the past that I didn't want in the next stage of my life. And needless to say, melanoma was one of those. So I put that firmly behind a door, closed it, turned around, opened a new door onto a world full of opportunities to do things that were important to me and things that I really wanted to do. And so it wasn't long under that new way of life that I was able to complete my challenge. And here I am on the 282nd mountain with my son. And before anybody says it, the hat just came off momentarily for the photo. But it does let you see that, unusually for me, I'm smiling. But that smile was actually masking the fact that I was actually in a lot of pain. It was pain that had been getting worse over several months. I thought it was probably due to some bruising because I'd had a tumble and sort of bashed myself, and I thought it would get better. I didn't think it was really anything serious, but I did mention it to the clinical nurse specialist, who's an absolutely wonderful person, by the way, and such an important role for us as patients, and I'm sure for the rest of the clinical team. She had me in to see the consultant the very next day. You really can't get better than that. Now, he always had a very gentle and reassuring manner. He examined me and said, I think we'll need to do an ultrasound just to find out what it is that's giving you pain, but he's very reassuring. As I was leaving, I overheard him whisper to mark it urgent. Even then, I didn't think that this was going to be melanoma. And to this day, I can't work out whether during this period, I genuinely didn't think that this was going to be melanoma, or somehow or other, the prospect of it was so horrendous that I was able to condition my mind to not let it think that it might be melanoma. But as far as I was concerned, I was looking forward to a bright future full of fun adventures and travel, and doing the things that were important to me and the things that we'd always wanted to do. And one of the things we'd always wanted to do was to get a camper van. We took delivery of it, drove it home, parked it in the driveway. We were standing there admiring it, taking pictures standing next to it as you do, thinking life was really sorted and it was going to be fun from here on in. And at that moment, the phone rang. It was a consultant. I couldn't even take him when he was saying, I had to hand the phone to my wife. So everything had been looking so good, so absolutely perfect for the future, and then crash, melanoma. I remember at the time liking it, a dreadful game of snakes and ladders where you think you're just about finished and you can pack it up and put it away and forget about it, but instead you hit the snake on number 99, jump, right the way back down to the start. You've got to start picking away back up again. I think during this time, I think outwardly I probably appeared to be reasonably cheerful. I certainly tried hard to be, but inwardly, and when I was lying awake at 3 in the morning, I was very, very pessimistic about what this might mean. When I was first diagnosed, I really didn't know much about melanoma, but now I did. So luckily, if that's the right word, it was just in one location and it could be excised. That was done, and I was then offered immunotherapy, and I was really keen about this. It hadn't been available when I was first diagnosed, but I'd kept abreast of developments, and I could see that this was really something of a game changer for many cases of melanoma. But when I started to find out more about it, I started to have serious reservations as to whether this was the right course of action for me in the circumstances. I thought that some of the long-term side effects, if I was in the minority that get any of them, could seriously affect my quality of life, my ability to do the things I wanted to do, and to live life the way I wanted to. After a lot of reflection, discussion, questions, I came back to that thinking that you need to maximize the odds of a good outcome and minimize the odds of a bad outcome. I also thought, I really do have confidence in this multidisciplinary team of people who really know their stuff, and they would not be offering this treatment unless there was a risk of melanoma coming back. And if that happened, then my family have to live with the consequences. It's not just about me. They're affected by all this too. It's been very tough, very worrying for them. And they've been very, very supportive, which I know is something I don't acknowledge as much as I should. So I embarked on the treatment, but I had to remind myself of the rationale on a few occasions. My second session of immunotherapy was the first day of the first COVID lockdown, when really you just wanted to be safe at home and certainly not in a hospital. I had an adverse reaction, which I found quite scary, but it was dealt with very professionally and efficiently. But from then on in, my treatment was a little bit more complex, and it took a lot longer each time. And I always had it in my mind that I might have another reaction like that. I started to get the sorts of side effects that many of you will be familiar with. And after about 3 or 4 months, I started to feel really quite unwell with a range of different symptoms, some of which I had never experienced before. And one morning I crashed out in the bathroom and ended up in hospital. Later that evening, an endocrinology consultant came to see me. Now, I had never even heard of endocrinology, and now it's a big bit of my life. And I'll never forget what he told me. He said that as a result of the immunotherapy, my body could no longer produce cortisol, and cortisol is essential for life. He said that every day for the rest of your life, you'll need to take tablets 3 times a day to try to mirror the natural production of cortisol, which varies through the day and depending on the stress levels that your body is under. He said if I didn't take the tablets, I would start to feel unwell quite quickly, become seriously unwell, and without any intervention, die. Wow. I spent a few days in hospital getting stabilized, and I have to say, feeling very sorry for myself. I thought that at best I had swapped one life-threatening condition for another, and that this one, adrenal insufficiency, was really going to affect the way that I lived my life and my ability to do all the things I wanted to do that were important to me. I was still feeling that the day that I was due to be discharged, and in addition, I really didn't want to go home. I was terrified about the prospect of going away and having another adrenal crisis without the safety net of the medical team around me. I think it was purely by chance, but a hospital chaplain came onto the ward and stopped to speak to me. We chatted for about 20 minutes. Now, I'm not a particularly religious person, and I don't remember faith being mentioned once in this conversation, but at the end of the conversation, I felt so much better in myself. It was definitely a pivotal moment for me. So I went home, treatment continued, and about towards the end, I think I still had 2 sessions to go, my heart rhythm became erratic and got gradually worse over a few days, and I ended up in an ambulance off to hospital. After that, I was referred to cardiology for various tests and checks and went along to an appointment there and to be told that everything was in working order, which is actually really nice to pass your MOT when you've just passed your 60th birthday. So that was reassuring to know. And I left the appointment and I was walking through the corridors of the hospital, a very large hospital, and I spotted a lone figure sitting in a waiting area, another melanoma patient, somebody who had contacted me through Melanoma Mates. And we met up on a few occasions for a coffee, a walk, most importantly, a chat, the sort of chat that you can only have with another melanoma patient. We were both really keen to get involved in raising awareness of melanoma. That day, we spoke briefly because it was in between appointments, and we agreed that once COVID restrictions allowed, we would meet up again and carry on that conversation. wished each other happy Christmas, and went our separate ways. That turned out to be the last time I would ever see her. After that, my treatment was stopped. I was quite happy to call it a day. And it's over 3 years on, I'm still on this damn snakes and ladders board. I've had a couple of scans that have given cause for concern and needed some further investigation and watch and wait. In the last year, I've had anxiety that's been worse than ever before, debilitating at times. And I found the need to phone the Melanoma Focus helpline, which I found really good. I thoroughly recommend it. A few months ago, I noticed a new mole had appeared, and other than the fact it was new, it didn't have any of the sort of ABCD to be of any concern. But the consultant said, I'll just take it off anyway, it's new, so just take it off, and because I would want to maximize the odds of good outcomes and minimize the odds of bad outcomes and not give melanoma a chance. Off it came, didn't think too much about it. Until last week, and I got the biopsy results, it's another primary melanoma. For any Blackadder fans, I wrote a note in my diary. It simply said, bugger. I also recently spent a whole day getting upset, frustrated, angry, trying to organize travel insurance, something that used to be so straightforward and far less expensive. After my treatment, I had some lingering side effects, or it might have been a consequence of adrenal insufficiency, but anyway, whatever it was, it originated from melanoma. And I ended up being referred to 2 further consultants in different disciplines who dealt with it very well. And I often reflect on the sheer number of people who've been directly involved in my care at all levels, all of whom have really been great. I've been very lucky. And I realized that mole that I wasn't actually too concerned about has now sent me on a little expedition around over 10 NHS specialisms. And one of them is obviously endocrinology for the adrenal insufficiency, which I have to be fair to say has not actually turned out to be as bad as I feared. But it does limit me, and it is sometimes very tricky to manage, and I'm still learning, sometimes the hard way. 18 months after the end of my treatment, it was my daughter's wedding. An emotional day for any parent, but I think when you've been through the sort of stuff that we've all been through, those emotions are really, really sharpened. And it was a very, very special day. But in the run-up to the wedding, in the week preceding it, I completely, really stupidly, completely misjudged the management of my adrenal insufficiency. And I learned a lesson, which I would want to share with anybody else with this condition, and that is be very careful of happy stress as well as bad stress. So a few hours before this picture was taken, I really was feeling extremely unwell. Luckily, we've got some doctors in the family, and they got me sorted, and after that, I was able to enjoy every minute of the day to the full, which included delivering the father of the bride speech, some of which I'd actually written even before my daughter even met her husband. But when I first started to realize a few years before just how serious melanoma might turn out to be, and I thought, if the worst happens and my daughter subsequently gets married, I want the speech that's made on that day to contain the words of her dad. I worry hugely about my daughter and my son. They've both got skin very like mine, and they've got a lot of moles, and I nag them and their spouses constantly to be vigilant. I often reflect on just how much I've learned since I was diagnosed with melanoma, and in particular, I think, had I always known what I know now, and of course acted upon it, then I possibly wouldn't have got melanoma in the first place, but if I had, I would have caught it much, much earlier and got it dealt with without, it would have been much more straightforward. I can't actually do anything to change that now, but I can perhaps do something to help to change it for future generations. And I find it surprisingly therapeutic and consoling to get involved in a bit of melanoma-related fundraising and awareness raising, things like the Sun-Safe Schools program. And to me, it feels as though I'm actually in a position to take the fight to melanoma rather than having to defend my body against an invasion of melanoma. And I always feel very positive when I get the chance to do something. Now, that might not work for everybody, but if it resonates with you, of course, you're in the right place here today to speak to people and get ideas about what you might do. Finally, I want to say melanoma has changed me in many ways, some good and some not, and some just a bit strange. And I want to finish with a bit of light-hearted audience participation. I'd like a show of hands, please, from anybody who can relate to what I'm about to say. So please don't be shy. Hands up if this resonates with you. Since I was diagnosed with melanoma, I've noticed that whenever I see somebody new, meeting them face to face, even just passing them in the street or seeing them on a screen, I nearly always notice any moles that are visible on their skin. Anybody else like that? Hands up. Yay, I'm not alone. That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you.